The killing of a police man or woman is still relatively rare in Britain. Since the world's first force, London's Metropolitan Police, was founded in 1829, barely more than one a year has been killed on duty throughout the country. Partly this may be because Britain's police are still normally unarmed, and partly because very few police killers have ever escaped justice. When one of their own is killed, the police are even more determined to solve the case. Until after the Second World War, when guns became much more readily available in Britain, stabbing rather than shooting was the usual cause of death, and the shooting of police was regarded with particular horror. Here are three stories which span this watershed. The first from the 1920s, when the killing of 3 policemen in 1910, which led to the siege of Sydney Street, was still remembered as extraordinary. The other two come from the 1950s, when the use of guns was becoming more widespread. But some 30 years earlier, it was still particularly shocking when, in the early morning of the 27th of September 1927, the body of a local constable was found by the side of this lane in the flat countryside of Essex, northeast of London. PC Gutteridge was lying on his back in the position marked by the bucket. He had been killed by 2 shots to the head. But more macabrely, his eyes had then been carefully shot out. It was reckoned that Gutteridge had been dead about 2 or 3 hours, and this was confirmed by his colleague on a neighbouring beat who had met up with him at 3:30 in the morning. Gutteridge appeared to have been surprised while taking down details, since there was no sign of a struggle and his pencil was tightly gripped in his hand. The first clue came that morning, when a blue Morris Cowley 4-seater was reported missing from a doctor's house about 10 miles from the scene of the murder. The car was soon found in Foxley Road in Brixton, South London, where it had been abandoned, blocking a narrow passageway. In the car was an empty cartridge case, and there were bloodstains by the driver's door. A pistol, of a type which matched the case, was later found in the Thames. But any hope that these discoveries might soon lead to a breakthrough proved false. After almost 4 months, the investigation seemed to have exhausted all its leads. Then, on the 20th of January 1928, police in Lavender Hill in South London decided to call on a minor local villain whom they suspected of burglary and dealing in stolen cars. Frederick Browne owned a perfectly legitimate garage. Nonetheless, he seemed unusually shifty, and the detectives found a reason to search him. In his pocket were 12 cartridges. A search of his car produced a fully loaded Webley revolver. Browne's garage and flat were now taken apart. Carefully hidden were 3 more revolvers, ammunition, and a mask. Browne was unable to give the names of the men he claimed to be hiding the weapons for. Police decided it might be interesting to interview his colleague at the garage, an Irishman named William Kennedy. But Kennedy turned out to be in Liverpool, and local police were asked to track him down. When they did so, he tried to shoot his way out, fortunately forgetting to release the safety catch on his pistol before doing so. Brought back by train to London, Kennedy soon made the startling confession that he knew all about the murder of PC Gutteridge. For several months before the murder, he and Browne had used the garage as a front for disposing of stolen cars and other property. Together they had formed a 2-man crime wave ranging across southern London and sometimes far outside. Browne had been particularly proud of the mask which he had made. On the night of the 8th of September, they had gone looking for cars in Essex. They had seen a particularly good one at the doctor's house, and after midnight they had forced the garage door and made off with it. On the way back, they had been stopped by PC Gutteridge. As he was noting the number, Browne pulled out a revolver, which Kennedy claimed to know nothing about, and shot Gutteridge twice in the face. As the policeman lay groaning with his eyes open, Browne said, "What are you looking at me like that for?" and shot him carefully in each eye. Frederick Browne had been born in 1881 in Catford in South London. He was 29 before he received his first conviction, a 1-year sentence for stealing a bicycle, but thereafter he was rarely out of prison. In 1916, Browne joined the Royal Engineers. He was discharged a week before the end of the war, having been convicted of petty theft. After a 10-month sentence, he went back to burglary, fraud, and car theft. In 1924, he was given a 4-year sentence, and it was at Dartmoor Prison that he met William Kennedy. Kennedy had been born in 1885 and brought up in Liverpool. He joined the army as a boy soldier and served in the Boer War. When the First World War began, he was in the reserves, but was unable to answer the call to the colours because he was serving a 3-year sentence for housebreaking. Upon release in 1916, he joined up, but soon deserted and ended up in Ireland fighting for the Republican forces during the rising against the British. Returning to Liverpool, he had served another 8 sentences for minor offences before meeting up with Browne in Dartmoor. When the trial of Browne and Kennedy began at the Old Bailey on the 23rd of April 1928, there was considerable argument as to whether Kennedy's confession should be admitted as evidence. But the judge, Mr. Justice Avery, ruled that it had been fairly obtained and should be allowed. In the event, it was not necessary, since forensic evidence by the ballistics expert, Robert Churchill, established beyond doubt that one of the guns found in Browne's car was the weapon which fired the fatal shots. The Webley revolver had a peculiar fault in the breech block, which made a distinctive mark on the cartridges it fired. Despite Kennedy's insistence that it had been Browne who had fired all the shots, both men were found guilty and sentenced to death. Browne was hanged at Pentonville Prison on the 31st of May, and Kennedy at Wandsworth. Although Kennedy had denied throughout that he knew anything about the gun that Browne was carrying, there was a general feeling that he was equally guilty and deserved to die. There was no such feeling in the second police killing, which also involved 2 people, only one of whom actually had and used a gun. This occurred almost exactly 25 years later, on the 2nd of November 1952, in Croydon, South London. The police had received a call that 2 youths had been seen climbing onto the roof of a warehouse and attempting to break in. An alert was put out and 4 policemen went to investigate. The warehouse in the Tamworth Road was owned by a wholesale confectioner. The boys had used some vent pipes in a side alley to get onto the roof, and 2 policemen went up the same way. As Detective Constable Frederick Fairfax got to the top, he shouted a challenge, and one of the boys replied, "Come and get us." Fairfax got over the parapet and dashed past the roof lights to grab one of the boys by the lift head. As he did so, the other boy pulled out a gun and shot Fairfax in the arm. Both Fairfax and his partner, Constable Norman Harrison, who had also reached the roof, heard the boy Fairfax had seized shout, "Let him have it, Chris," just before the shot was fired. Fairfax pulled his captive past the roof lights. The boy made no attempt to get away as they took cover behind the solid brick stairhead. By now, the other 2 policemen had been joined by more officers. They got into the warehouse and dashed up the stairs. As the first of them stepped out onto the roof, the boy with the gun, who was still about 20 feet away by the lift head, fired. Constable Sidney Miles fell dead, shot between the eyes. The boy with the gun continued firing at random from his shelter by the lift head and taunting the police to come and get him. When he ran out of ammunition, he dashed to the parapet, climbed onto it, and dived headfirst off the roof. His fall was broken by a greenhouse in the yard, and he crashed to the ground, breaking his spine, wrist, and shoulder blade. As he was taken away, the boy with the gun was identified as 16-year-old Christopher Craig. He was already well known to the local police as a troublemaker. Dyslexic and disruptive at school from an early age, Craig was nonetheless a lively, entertaining, and popular boy. He grew up fascinated by guns and admired his brother, who had received a prison sentence for armed robbery. Christopher Craig collected and carried illegal guns, which were relatively easy to get hold of after the Second World War. Craig cultivated a tough guy image, and on the night of the shooting was wearing a long overcoat and trilby hat. His companion, 18-year-old Derek Bentley, who had been captured so easily on the roof, was very different. Although tall and very strong, he was mentally slow, illiterate, and prone to epileptic fits. When called up for military service, he had been rejected as unfit for training. Craig had encouraged Bentley to join him in various minor robberies and had given him a set of knuckle dusters. The two young men seemed to epitomize a post-war wave of juvenile crime and lawlessness which had led by the early 1950s to a widespread feeling that the country was close to anarchy. Many leading figures, including the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Goddard, felt that Britain was being swamped by permissiveness and that an example should be made before things got completely out of hand. And it was Lord Goddard himself who was the judge at the trial of Craig and Bentley, which began at the Old Bailey on the 9th of December 1952. The trial was to revolve around 2 points. Had Bentley known that Craig was carrying a gun, and had his cry of "Let him have it, Chris," been intended to encourage him to use it? Christmas Humphreys KC, who led the prosecution, had no doubts that Bentley both knew of Craig's gun and wanted him to use it. The fact that Bentley had effectively been under arrest when the fatal shot was fired made no difference to his guilt. Craig's counsel, John Parris, attempted to show that his gun, which had a sawn-off barrel, was so inaccurate that hitting anything over 6 feet away would be purely accidental. Craig had only fired as a bluff, and hitting Constable Miles had been a dreadful accident. The judge quashed this line of defense by stating that if Parris intended to base his case on it, the jury would be instructed that it was no defense at all. Craig had intended to kill, and no matter how inaccurate his weapon, that was all that mattered. In the event, Craig was too young at 16 to receive a death sentence, so the main thrust of the trial now centered on whether Bentley was guilty. Craig assured the court that Bentley would not have known that he had a gun that evening, although he admitted to carrying one frequently. He also denied ever hearing the words, "Let him have it," but all 3 policemen who had been within earshot at the time agreed that these were the words Bentley had used, and were convinced that he had intended to encourage Craig to fire. Bentley's counsel, Frank Cassell, emphasized that the youth had made no attempt to evade the police. Strangely, he failed to put forward the possibility that Bentley's cry might have been begging Craig to surrender the gun. When he was put into the witness box, Bentley's slowness and difficulty in making himself understood allowed the prosecution to score many telling points, including an apparent admission that he had not been under arrest at the time of the shooting. In his summing up, the judge made it clear that he had grave difficulty in understanding the defense case on behalf of Craig. He dismissed all Bentley's statements in less than 20 seconds. The jury seemed equally decisive, taking only an hour and a quarter to find both boys guilty. They recommended mercy for Derek Bentley, but this could not prevent the judge from being obliged to pronounce the death sentence on him. Too young to hang, Craig was sentenced to be detained during His Majesty's pleasure. Given the jury's recommendation that mercy should be shown, and the facts that Bentley was only just over the legal age for execution, had not actually taken part in the shooting, and was epileptic and mentally very slow, there was a widespread expectation, not least among his family, that the Home Secretary would issue a reprieve. But Sir David Maxwell Fyfe was more concerned about the public's fear of juvenile violence, and seemed determined to make an example. On the 26th of January 1953, Bentley's family heard, at first from journalists, not the Home Office, that a reprieve had been refused. Last-minute appeals for mercy by the opposition Labour Party were dismissed by the Home Secretary as attempts to score political points. Derek Bentley was hanged on the morning of the 28th of January. There was a large crowd of protesters, and when officials attempted to put up the notice of execution, they were pelted and attacked. For many people, Derek Bentley's execution was a gross miscarriage of justice. It undoubtedly played a major part in the change of public opinion which led to the abolition of the death penalty 12 years later. But this change in the law came too late for one other police killer, who was to prove the last man hanged for murdering an officer in Great Britain. In July 1959, Verne Schiffman, an American model on holiday in London, received a blackmail note. The writer claimed to have compromising photographs, which he would make public unless paid £500. Knowing she had nothing to hide, Mrs. Schiffman went to the police. They arranged for her phone to be tapped, and officers asked her to try to keep the blackmailer talking for as long as possible when he called. A call came on the 12th of July and was traced to a telephone box outside South Kensington Underground station. Two detectives raced from Chelsea Police Station, and Raymond Purdy reached the box in time to see the blackmailer still talking. He pulled the man out and arrested him. But as the detectives were taking him back to their car, the blackmailer broke free and ran across the road and down Onslow Square. They chased him into a block of flats, number 105. Arrested in the hall, the man suddenly pulled out a gun and shot Detective Sergeant Purdy dead at point-blank range. While Purdy's partner, Detective Sergeant Sandford, was trying to help his colleague, the man dashed out into the street and disappeared. A nationwide manhunt was launched. The police had a good description of the gunman. He had left a very clear palm print in the hall when cornered, and a 9mm cartridge case and spent bullet were found. But the most vital clue was found when Detective Sergeant Purdy's widow was going through his personal possessions. She discovered the notebook which the blackmailer had been using when Purdy had pulled him out of the telephone box. This belonged to a West German citizen, Gunther Fritz Podola, who had arrived in Britain from Dusseldorf on the 21st of May. Podola had recently been deported from Canada, and the Canadian police sent photographs and fingerprint records which confirmed that he was the man. But despite the search, no trace of Podola could be found until the morning of the 16th of July. The manager of the Claremont House Hotel, just across the old Brompton Road from Onslow Square, contacted the police. One of his guests had not left his room for 3 days. On being shown Podola's photograph, the manager confirmed that it was him. During the afternoon, more than 200 policemen surrounded the hotel. Then a team of armed detectives went up to the room. They shouted for Podola to open up, and then, led by Detective Sergeant Chambers, burst through the door, hitting Podola in the face. he was pinned on the floor and suddenly seemed to faint. Once he had been revived, Padola was taken to Chelsea police station. There he was examined by police doctors who found him dazed and with a bruised face, but otherwise physically all right. But when the police began to question him, Padola remained silent and refused to speak. Doctors decided that he must have concussion. When he was still not speaking after 7 hours, they took him to St. Stephen's Hospital. Quite soon, Padola was starting to communicate with doctors, but insisting that he had completely lost his memory, who he was, what had happened, why he was under arrest. Doctors carried out many tests, but never came up with any explanation for this. Nevertheless, they assured magistrates that Padola was fit to go for trial for murder. Meanwhile, the police had been filling in some of Gunter Fritz Padola's missing background. He had been born in Germany in 1929. A solitary but intelligent child, he had shown promise as a musician, but his family's life was totally disrupted by the outbreak of the Second World War. Padola was a member of the Hitler Youth, and his father was called up to fight in the army. In 1942, he was killed in Stalingrad. Padola and his mother were in Berlin during the Russian invasion and ended up in the Soviet-occupied Eastern Zone. To support himself and his mother, Padola learned to work the black markets, how to beg, borrow, and steal in order to survive. As some semblance of normality was restored, he trained to become a plumber. In August 1952, Padola escaped to the Allied zone and got a permit to go to Canada. There he lapsed back into crime and was finally deported back to West Germany in 1958. In May 1959, he came to London and was soon appearing in the clubs of Soho, claiming to be a gangster and boasting that he hated the police and would shoot his way out if ever arrested. Padola's claim of amnesia meant that he potentially faced 2 trials, the first to decide whether he was medically fit to be tried for murder, and the second for the murder itself. The first began on the 10th of September, 1959, before Mr. Justice Edmund Davis. After 10 days of listening to conflicting evidence about the possible causes of Padola's amnesia, the jury decided that he was faking and must be fit to stand trial. The murder trial began with a new jury on the 23rd of September. Padola's defense counsel began by telling the court that he had a major problem, that he had no idea what Padola's defense should be, since his client would not discuss it with him. For the prosecution, Maxwell Turner QC presented an almost watertight case with its detailed forensic links between Padola, a gun found in the hotel, and the shooting. When Padola was called to make a statement, he simply repeated that he could remember nothing and must therefore not be guilty. This plea failed yet again. On the 24th, after a withdrawal of less than 40 minutes, Padola was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was hanged on the 5th of November, 1959, at Wandsworth Prison, the last man to be executed in Great Britain for killing a policeman. Police killings always arouse strong emotions, but it is significant that since the death penalty was abolished, there has not been any dramatic increase in the number of policemen or women killed on duty each year in Britain.